The year was 1937. Japan was already steeped in tension, a nation on the edge of transformation, torn between tradition, militarism, and the looming shadow of war. But deep in a quiet prefecture, far from the roar of political speeches and the clash of armies, there stood a school. An ordinary wooden structure on the outside, nestled between trees that whispered in the wind, hiding its true nature beneath the veneer of everyday life. Parents sent their children there with trust. Teachers walked the halls with measured steps. Laughter once echoed in the playground. Chalk dust once drifted in classrooms, and ink once stained the small hands of students learning their lessons. Yet beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, and inside the narrow corridors, something else lived. Something that would not only strip away laughter, but strip away faces themselves. By the end of that year, the school was no longer remembered for its lessons. It was remembered for silence, for the way the air grew heavy inside, for the way students disappeared only to be found again, lifeless, unrecognizable, without the faces that once carried their innocence. The story begins with whispers. Parents spoke of headaches their children suffered after returning home. Strange marks appeared on the walls, chalk drawings that no one admitted to making, distorted sketches of human figures with blurred features. Teachers reported exhaustion, eyes that refused to rest, and the faint sound of chanting at night when the classroom should have been empty. But the most chilling whispers were about the mirror in the east hallway. A tall, cracked mirror left behind from an older era. Students claimed it showed them not as they were, but as they would be, hollowed, faceless, unformed. Some refused to pass it, running with books clutched tightly, afraid of their own reflection. At first, no one spoke openly. It was a time when superstition and silence lived side by side with duty. But silence cannot contain terror forever. The first body was discovered in early spring. A boy no older than 12 lying face down in the science room. When they turned him over, his classmates screamed. His skin was pale, his eyes open, but his face was smooth, featureless, as though erased by unseen hands. No nose, no mouth, no trace of identity, just skin stretched across bone. A mask of nothingness where life once had been. Authorities called it a tragedy, a freak condition, a medical mystery. But parents whispered another word, cursed. The second came weeks later. A girl in the library, slumped between shelves of history books, her features gone, her body cold. Then another in the music room, violin clutched tightly, bow still drawn across strings that would never sound again. Each time the story was suppressed. Officials tried to explain it as illness, accident, hallucination, anything but what it was. Yet the teachers knew. The students knew. The parents who pulled their children from the school knew. Something ancient had awakened inside those walls. Something that consumed not just life but identity, erasing what made a person human. Whispers became rumors, rumors became legend. Some said the school had been built over a burial ground, bones of the forgotten restless beneath the foundations. Others believed it was punishment for arrogance, for daring to build a place of learning where once a shrine had stood. And some went further, whispering of forbidden experiments, of shadowed figures who used children as vessels to test poisons, chemicals, or rituals meant to manipulate the soul itself. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. Students entered with faces, with identities, with smiles, and some never returned, or returned with nothing left of who they had been. The year darkened. Fear grew thicker than the fog that rolled across the playground at dusk. Children stopped laughing. Teachers stopped singing the morning hymns. Windows rattled when there was no wind. Books fell from shelves without touch. And at night, when the lamps were extinguished, the school itself seemed to breathe. Some swore they heard scratching behind the walls, faint moans seeping through floorboards, and the sound of footsteps pacing in classrooms long emptied. The parents begged for the school to be closed, but authorities insisted it remain. It was 1937. Japan had no patience for weakness, no time for superstition. But denial did not stop the deaths. By winter, the count had risen. Nearly a dozen students, each found without faces, each discovery more horrifying than the last. The school should have been abandoned, but instead it became a place of fear and fascination. Soldiers passed by and crossed themselves. Priests refused to bless its halls. And still, the mirror in the east hallway stood, cracked, waiting, reflecting not light but shadow. Some said the mirror was the key, a doorway, a curse. Others believed it was only a symptom, a piece of the puzzle too large to grasp. The Macabre school, they began to call it. A place where laughter vanished, where innocence was stolen, where the walls themselves seemed to hunger. The children who survived spoke only in fragments. One whispered that shadows covered her classmates' mouths before they vanished. Another said she saw a teacher's face melt into smoothness for a moment, then return as if nothing had happened. And one, trembling, said that the mirror did not just reflect, it pulled, dragging away the parts of you that defined who you were, leaving behind only the shell. As snow fell in the closing months of 1937, the school was finally sealed. Desks remained abandoned, chalk dust still clung to the blackboards, books lay open on unfinished lessons. But the silence that settled over those halls was not peace. It was watching, waiting, remembering. The students who had lost their faces were never explained. Their bodies were buried quietly, their names whispered only in hushed tones. The official record said nothing. The government left the matter unspoken, erased like the very faces of its victims. But the locals remembered, the parents remembered, and the school remained, a scar on the land, a house of shadows where time itself seemed to pause. This was no ordinary tragedy. It was a mystery carved into the heart of a nation already drowning in conflict, a horror that could not be rationalized, a tale that would be whispered for generations. The Macabre school of 1937 became a legend, a nightmare that blurred the lines between curse, crime, and punishment. And its story, buried beneath decades of silence, still breathes when the wind passes through abandoned hallways, when mirrors crack without cause, when faces in dreams dissolve into smooth blank nothingness. The school had not always been a place of dread. When it first opened its doors in the early years of the Showa era, it was built with pride, a wooden structure with sliding doors, paper windows, and polished floors that reflected the soft glow of lantern light. Situated in a rural prefecture, the school was meant to represent progress, a symbol of education reaching even the most isolated corners of Japan. The land it stood on had a complicated past, though few spoke of it directly. Elders whispered that a shrine had once stood there, a small wooden structure dedicated to forgotten spirits, where offerings of rice and salt were left beneath an ancient tree. That tree had been cut down to clear space for the school. The shrine stones were removed, stacked to the side, and eventually buried under soil and foundation. Progress demanded sacrifice, and in 1937, sacrifice often meant erasing the old to make way for the new. But erasure has a cost. The families who sent their children there were simple, hard-working, tied to fields and fishing boats. They believed in the importance of learning, but also carried deep respect for the unseen world. When the school opened, they celebrated with banners, songs, and the promise of a brighter future. The children laughed in the courtyard, their voices carrying through the fields, filling the air with life. Yet even in those early days, there were signs. Teachers reported strange drafts in sealed rooms, faint knocking sounds behind walls, and the mirror in the east hallway, a relic said to have belonged to the shrine, left standing as though watching the children pass. Some thought it harmless, others uneasy. The mirror was cracked, tall and heavy, its frame carved with faded symbols no one could translate. When children looked into it, some said they saw themselves smiling when they were not, or frowning when they were happy, small distortions that unsettled them in ways words could not explain. Over time, the school developed a reputation for strangeness. Books would go missing only to reappear in odd places. Chalk would write on the boards without a teacher's hand, and sometimes when classes ended and the halls grew quiet, faint footsteps echoed as though another class continued unseen. The principal, a stern man named Hideo Tanaka, dismissed such stories as childish imagination. He believed in order, discipline, and the advancement of education. His voice carried authority, but his eyes often betrayed unease when standing in the east hallway. Teachers whispered when he was gone, saying he avoided the mirror, never meeting his own reflection. The children were less restrained. They spoke in hushed voices of shadows moving differently than the bodies that cast them, of whispers that rose from the floorboards at night, of dreams that all seemed to share similar themes, faces melting, mirrors cracking, and classrooms filled with faceless classmates staring without eyes. The families noticed changes too. Children came home pale, restless, unable to sleep. Some woke screaming in the night, clawing at their own skin as though trying to peel something away. Parents reported to Tanaka, but he waved them off, insisting it was stress, imagination, or illness. Yet behind closed doors, some parents admitted they feared the school was cursed. One mother claimed she saw her daughter's reflection in the window delay by half a second, smiling when the girl herself did not. Another father swore he saw his son standing in the yard long after the boy had gone inside. Such stories spread, but they remained contained within the village. In 1937, Japan was not a place where superstition was allowed to overshadow duty. Fear was swallowed, silence maintained, and the school continued its lessons as though nothing were wrong. Still, there were teachers who remembered the land before the school. Old women spoke of the shrine that once stood beneath the tree, a place where offerings were made to keep restless spirits satisfied. They warned that to disturb such places without proper ceremony was dangerous. Tanaka dismissed them as relics of the past, but others noticed how the earth itself seemed uneasy. Cracks appeared along the foundation despite constant repair. The wind carried a mournful tone when it passed through the yard. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills, the school's shadow stretched unnaturally long, bending across the village like a hand reaching to claim it. The background of the Macabre school was thus built not only of wood and nails, but of silence, arrogance, and the refusal to respect what came before. Its foundation was not only physical but spiritual, laid atop forgotten stones, disturbed soil, and ignored warnings. By the time the first faceless body appeared, the stage had already been set. The land had remembered what had been taken from it, and it demanded recognition in the only way it could, through fear, through erasure, through the blank smoothness of stolen identity. The villagers could sense this, though none dared say it aloud. Their silence became complicity, their fear became fuel, and the school grew darker with every passing day. As the school settled into its daily rhythm, the darker undercurrents refused to fade. Students grew accustomed to the strangeness, though unease seeped into their lives like a slow poison. They joked about the footsteps that followed them, laughed nervously at the cracked mirror, and tried to ignore the way the air felt heavy in certain classrooms. Yet no amount of laughter could erase the truth. Something unseen lingered. Teachers, too, carried their own burdens. Miss Aoki, a young woman assigned to teach literature, confided in her diary about dreams that woke her drenched in sweat. She described classrooms filled with children whose faces had melted into blank, featureless skin, their hands raised as though begging her to recognize them. Each morning she arrived to find scratches on her desk, words carved so faintly that only under certain light did they appear. They were not words she understood, symbols twisted and sharp, similar to the faded carvings around the old mirror frame. Another teacher, Mr. Sato, a stern man with little patience for superstition, once stayed behind late to mark papers. When he finally left, he swore he saw a child standing at the end of the hall. He called out, but the child did not move. As he approached, the figure turned, revealing not a face but a smooth, pale surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Mr. Sato stumbled, dropped his papers, and when he looked again, the hall was empty. He resigned within the month, citing family matters, though whispers suggested otherwise. The community began to fracture. Parents debated whether to remove their children, but the principal's reassurances, combined with the pressures of society, kept most from acting. In 1937, withdrawing a child from school was no small act. It carried stigma, the weight of disobedience against modernity. So families endured even as the stories grew darker. Some children began to vanish for hours during the school day, later found wandering near the river with no memory of how they got there. Others sat in class staring blankly at the wall, unresponsive to teachers, their bodies present but their minds unreachable. When shaken, they returned as if nothing had happened, unable to explain. Illness spread too. Strange fevers, sudden nosebleeds, coughing fits that left children weak. Doctors blamed poor sanitation, bad diets, or the damp climate. Yet none of their treatments stopped the symptoms from circling back again and again. The villagers whispered that the land itself was rejecting the school, pushing back against the intrusion of human order. They pointed to the cracks in the ground, the way plants refused to grow near the foundation, the eerie silence that fell over the yard when dusk approached. The local shrine keeper, an old man named Kuroda, warned Tanaka that the school was built on sacred soil. He insisted that rituals had been ignored, that the spirits once honored there were now restless. Tanaka laughed, dismissing him as senile. But others remembered Kuroda's words when, one morning, students found birds scattered across the courtyard. their bodies twisted, their eyes missing. It was written off as disease, but the children whispered that the school had taken their faces just as it would take theirs. Backgrounds are not only about facts and history, they are about the roots that feed the horror. In the case of this school, the roots were deep, tangled with forgotten worship and arrogant dismissal. The land itself seemed alive, its memory carved into the very air. At night, the wind whistled through the empty halls and neighbors swore it sounded like weeping. A janitor, one of the few who dared remain late, reported that when he cleaned the east hallway, his reflection in the mirror did not mimic him. He swept left, but the figure swept right. He spat on the ground, but the reflection smiled. He never spoke of it publicly, but his silence grew heavier until one day he too vanished. His home left empty, his futon cold. The village carried on, though unease spread like a sickness. Every parent felt the dread, every teacher bore the weight, every child lived with whispers. Yet no one left. No one shut the doors, no one tore the school down. Pride, fear, and denial bound them together, trapping them within a story that was no longer theirs to control. The school had claimed the land, but the land was reclaiming itself in return. By the end of 1937, the building stood not only as a place of learning, but as a monument to arrogance, ignorance, and the thin line between progress and blasphemy. Its wooden beams groaned at night like a body in pain. Its windows reflected things no one wished to see, and its hallways carried the sound of lessons taught long after the students had gone home. The background had been written in silence and bloodless warnings, setting the stage for what would come. And what would come was not gentle. It would not be ignored. It would reveal itself in ways that stripped identity, erased humanity, and left only the hollow surface of faceless victims staring into eternity. Rumors began to spread like cracks in the plaster walls, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Children carried stories home, their voices trembling yet eager to share, and within days the entire village seemed to hum with whispers of what lingered inside the school. They said that if you stood in the east hallway after sunset, you could hear a chorus of voices chanting in a language no one could recognize. They said if you dared to look into the cracked mirror alone, your reflection would blink out of sync, and if you lingered too long, your face would not come back at all. By autumn of 1937, unease had grown into something sharper, something more dangerous. Parents told their children to avoid the mirror, to walk quickly past the east wing, to pray quietly before bed. Some mothers tucked small amulets into their children's uniforms, charms of protection passed down from older generations. Others sprinkled salt across thresholds, whispering names of gods long forgotten. The atmosphere of the school shifted. Laughter became rare, replaced by hushed tones and stolen glances. Teachers noticed how students hesitated before answering roll call, as though uncertain whether their names truly belonged to them. More than once, a teacher swore a child answered when present, but later discovered that same child absent, sick at home, the voice having belonged to no one at all. The build-up to horror is always paved with denial, and this village was no exception. Principal Tanaka continued to enforce discipline, refusing to acknowledge the growing strangeness. He demanded silence about the rumors, threatened punishment for spreading fear, and claimed the faint noises in the walls were nothing more than rats. But the children knew better. Their innocence did not shield them. It sharpened their senses. They saw the shadows moving when no one walked, felt the cold hand brush against their necks in empty classrooms, and woke from dreams where they sat among classmates with no eyes. No mouths, only skin stretched smooth and pale. A girl named Yumi began to refuse school altogether. Her parents dragged her by the arm, her small body trembling, her voice shrill as she screamed that the mirror had taken her smile. When pressed, she described how her reflection no longer showed teeth when she laughed, only lips curling upward over blank skin. Her parents, ashamed of her hysteria, begged Tanaka to intervene. He lectured her sternly, but when she stared at him with hollow eyes, he faltered, then barked louder to cover his fear. Yumi never returned after that week. The family claimed illness, but her house grew silent. Her windows shuttered as though she had vanished from life itself. Stories like hers multiplied. Children reported hearing their names whispered in corridors when no one stood nearby. Chalk dust filled the air without hands to stir it. Once, during an arithmetic lesson, the numbers on the board rearranged themselves into symbols that mirrored those carved into the mirror frame. The teacher, pale with terror, erased them quickly, pretending nothing had happened. Fear became part of the daily routine. Students lined up with their heads bowed, Teachers kept their voices steady while their hands trembled, and parents waited at the gate with prayers unspoken. But rumors are not just stories. They are warnings. They carry the weight of truth dressed in fear, and every whisper in that village pointed toward something escalating, something clawing its way closer. The buildup was not sudden but steady, like the slow tightening of a noose, each day another knot pulling tighter. A group of older boys, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, dared one another to stay overnight inside the school. They boasted of their courage, claimed they would prove nothing haunted the halls. They never returned. At dawn, villagers found their sandals outside the gate, neatly arranged as though placed by invisible hands. Inside the school, their names were written on the chalkboard, each letter uneven, shaky as though traced by children who had no fingers. Panic rippled through the community, though the official word was that the boys had run away. Their families wailed in silence, their grief swallowed by shame. Still the stories grew. Some said they heard the boys' laughter echoing faintly in the east wing, followed by sudden silence, as if voices had been erased mid-breath. Others swore they saw figures at the windows waving for help with faces hidden behind smooth, featureless masks. Each tale fanned the flames of fear, until the school itself seemed alive, pulsing with anticipation, feeding on the terror it had sown. The build-up to the faceless tragedy was nearly complete. The air grew heavier, the nights colder, the sense of being watched inescapable, and all the while, the cracked mirror stood in the hallway, patient and unyielding, waiting for the next child to look too closely, the next soul to lose its face to the silence beyond glass. As winter settled over the village, the school's atmosphere thickened into something oppressive, a weight pressing down on everyone who crossed its gates. The days grew shorter, shadows stretched longer, and the line between dream and waking blurred for students and teachers alike. Some claimed they no longer slept at all, only drifted in and out of half-conscious visions where faceless figures stood over their beds. The rumors by now were no longer dismissed as imagination. They had woven themselves into daily life. A boy named Hiroshi told his parents he could not find his own reflection in the mirror at home, only an empty silhouette staring back. His parents smashed the glass in fear, but the boy continued to insist that when he blinked, his reflection blinked moments later, its mouth moving without sound. Another child, Ayako, drew pictures obsessively during lessons. At first the drawings seemed harmless, classrooms, courtyards, faces of her friends. But over time the faces became blank ovals, rows of children without features, hands raised in silent cries. Teachers confiscated her sketches, but more appeared each day, as though she could not stop her hand from drawing what her eyes insisted on seeing. Soon she too stopped attending school, her absence explained away with the vague word, illness. Parents spoke less openly now, their fear sealed tight behind closed doors. To admit the truth meant acknowledging that something unholy had claimed their children, and so they clung to excuses, explanations that fit the world they wished to believe in. But inside, they knew. They saw the same blank stares in the village streets, the same hesitation when a child smiled, the same odd delay in gestures reflected in water or window glass. The fear seeped outward beyond the school walls, staining the village itself. Crops failed without reason, animals refused to graze near the schoolyard, and fishermen claimed the river carried an unnatural chill. Even the local shrine, once a place of solace, grew quiet, its offerings of rice left untouched, the air heavy with silence. Yet the greatest tension lay in the school itself, where the children remained trapped each day. Teachers walked through lessons with stiff voices, their eyes darting to corners, their ears straining for whispers that slithered between walls. The sound of chalk scraping across blackboards sometimes continued after the teachers had set the sticks down. Doors closed without hands, books fell from shelves, and in the east wing the cracked mirror grew darker, its surface clouded as though something inside pressed against the glass, waiting to step through. One evening, a group of students reported seeing their teacher's face vanish while she lectured. They insisted her eyes and mouth melted away, leaving her skin smooth and pale before returning moments later as if nothing had happened. The teacher, horrified, denied it, but her trembling hands betrayed her. That night she burned her lesson notes and refused to enter that classroom again. Rumors escalated into dread, dread into panic, and panic into a collective silence. No one dared speak of what was truly happening, for fear that naming it aloud might invite it closer. The buildup reached a fever pitch when a ceremony was suggested by the old shrine keeper, Kuroda. He begged the community to restore balance, to honor the spirits whose resting place had been violated. But Tanaka scoffed, calling him senile, accusing him of filling children's heads with nonsense. The villagers, caught between modern duty and ancient fear, did nothing. And so the school continued, its halls buzzing with whispers, its rooms colder with each passing day, its children slipping further into something unrecognizable. A storm brewed not in the skies but in the very walls of the building, and everyone sensed it. The faceless figures were no longer confined to dreams or fleeting glimpses. They lingered at the edges of sight, reflected in windows, captured in drawings, whispered of in tears. The school was preparing to reveal its true horror, and the build-up, slow and relentless, had carried the village to the brink of tragedy. When the first student collapsed in the courtyard, her face blank as polished wood, it was no surprise. It was inevitability. The build-up was complete, the silence ready to shatter, and the faceless nightmare prepared to step fully into the waking world. The day of revelation did not arrive with thunder or warning. It crept in quietly, as though the school itself had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and when it came, no one could claim surprise because every rumor, every whisper, every pale, sleepless night had been leading here. The morning air felt unnatural, heavy, clinging to the lungs of the children as they walked toward the gate. Some hesitated, dragging their feet. Others clutched charms tied beneath their uniforms, but all felt the weight of something unseen pressing against their small bodies. Teachers noticed it too, though they forced themselves into routine greetings, voices sharp with discipline, hiding the fear that flickered behind their eyes. The building loomed larger that morning, its wooden frame groaning as if alive, its windows dark, swallowing light instead of reflecting it. Inside the classrooms, the air was colder than winter winds. Chalk squeaked across blackboards, though no one held it. Papers fluttered without breeze, and the faint smell of something burnt clung to the walls. By midday, the illusion of control collapsed. A boy in the east hallway screamed, a sound that tore through the quiet like glass shattering, and when his classmates rushed to him, they recoiled in terror. His face was gone, not bruised or wounded, but smoothed into pale skin, stretched where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. He clawed at his own head as though searching for features that no longer existed, his body convulsing before falling still. The children fled, their cries echoing down the halls, and with their screams the silence of the school broke into chaos. Teachers attempted to gather students, but the walls themselves betrayed them. Doors slammed without hands, locking some rooms tight. Windows rattled, then shattered outward, glass spraying into the courtyard. The cracked mirror in the east hallway pulsed with a dull glow, its surface rippling like disturbed water. Those who dared glance at it swore they saw hundreds of faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide, mouths screaming in silence, begging to be freed or warning those still outside. One teacher tried to cover the faceless boy's body with her coat, but when she lifted her eyes, 3 more children had become like him, their blank faces tilting upward in unison, their smooth skin reflecting the flicker of lantern light like polished masks. The teacher ran, her footsteps frantic, her voice lost in the roar of terror. Panic spread as children collided in corridors that twisted upon themselves. Some swore they ran toward the exit only to find themselves returning again and again to the same mirror, no matter which turn they took. Others vanished entirely, one moment clutching the hands of friends, the next dissolved into reflections that moved half a second behind reality. Principal Tanaka stormed into the chaos, shouting commands, demanding order, his voice echoing louder than the children's cries, but when he stood before the mirror, his authority cracked. A jagged fissure split further across the glass, and from within, something stirred. A shadow emerged, tall and formless, its body a writhing mass of faceless heads, blank and pale, turning in every direction without eyes. It stepped from the mirror, dragging a silence that devoured all sound, the screams dying in throats, the sobs falling mute. Even the heartbeat seemed to pause in terror. The faceless children moved in unison, their limbs jerking like puppets controlled by strings. They surrounded Tanaka, who for the first time faltered, his iron discipline reduced to trembling. He tried to shout again, but his voice was gone. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. Slowly, before the eyes of the surviving staff and students, his features melted, eyes sinking into smooth skin, mouth dissolving, nose erased, until he stood faceless like the rest. Outside, villagers had gathered, drawn by the rising noise, only to witness the building shift unnaturally. Its roofline seemed to sag and rise like breathing. The wooden beams groaned as if under immense weight, and the windows reflected not the sky but the faces of countless children, their features erased, their palms pressed against the glass in desperate silence. Some villagers screamed prayers, others fell to their knees, but none dared enter. Inside, the climax reached frenzy. Children clawed at doors that dissolved into blank walls. Desks and chairs slid across rooms as though pushed by invisible hands. In one classroom, numbers written on the board melted into jagged symbols that pulsed with faint light. A group of students huddled together, eyes squeezed shut, but one by one their features vanished, their identities erased, until only smooth masks remained. Teachers, too, were claimed. Miss Aoki, who once dreamed of faceless children, now joined them, her mouth disappearing mid-cry. Mr. Sato's replacement collapsed, his hands frozen in prayer, his eyes erased first, leaving only empty skin where he sought salvation. The faceless moved slowly, without urgency, as though time no longer held meaning. They turned their blank heads toward the living, and though they had no eyes, every survivor swore they felt the weight of being watched, judged, claimed. The shadow creature from the mirror spread its limbs wide, touching walls, ceiling, floor, its body merging with the building itself until the school groaned as though it had become flesh. The villagers outside saw this too, the wood bending, the walls shuddering, and some claimed they heard a low moan, a sound like 100 children breathing together. The climax of horror did not peak with one act but cascaded endlessly, each moment darker than the last. Some children were dragged into the mirror, their bodies rippling into glass like water, their hands clawing against the surface as their reflections swallowed them whole. Others simply fell where they stood, their features erased in an instant. One teacher attempted to smash the mirror, swinging a chair with desperate strength, but the wood splintered in her hands, and her face vanished before she could scream. Outside, the sky darkened though no clouds moved overhead. The birds fled. The dogs howled, and the ground trembled with vibrations that rattled the stones of the village paths. The shrine keeper Kuroda fell to his knees weeping, crying that the spirits had returned to claim what was theirs. The villagers pressed salt to their doors, prayed to gods who would not listen, and still they watched as the school became a mouth swallowing its own children. The faceless moved to the windows. Dozens, then hundreds, blank masks pressed against glass, their heads tilting in unison, their palms leaving no prints, only cold silence. Survivors would later say that in those final minutes, time itself seemed to vanish. The screams were gone, the air heavy, the halls endless, and the mirror consuming. The climax did not end in fire or collapse, but in erasure, a wiping away of identity, until the building held only silence and blank faces staring outward into eternity. Night fell with a suffocating swiftness as though the sun had been stolen from the sky, and the school stood in the dark like a tomb, its walls trembling with whispers that no human tongue had formed. The villagers, frozen at a distance, watched lantern flames flicker and die though no wind stirred, leaving only the pale glow of the cursed windows that pulsed faintly as though alive. The faceless pressed against the glass in rows, children, teachers, even Tanaka himself, their smooth skin gleaming in the dimness like porcelain masks. They did not move with human rhythm, but with the slow synchronization of something eternal, tilting their heads together, raising blank faces toward the moonless heavens. The earth around the building began to shiver as if countless footsteps pounded beneath the soil. Some swore they heard a rhythm, a steady drumbeat echoing from below. Others claimed it was the sound of nails scratching from inside the earth, as if the buried dead had been roused. Fear broke the courage of the strongest men, who turned and fled to the mountains, but others remained unable to look away, transfixed by the horror unfolding before them. From the heart of the school the mirror glowed brighter, its cracked surface bleeding with pale light that spilled across the floors like water. The shadow creature unfurled itself further, stretching beyond the limits of form, its limbs twisting through corridors, merging with beams, pulsing in rhythm with the faceless throng. It was no longer a reflection but a doorway, an opening into something that should never have been touched by the living. The faceless children began to move, their arms jerking upward in unison, their bodies stiff, mechanical, like marionettes bound by invisible threads. One by one they pressed their palms to the glass, and the glow of the mirror flared with each touch. Their identities were gone, but their essence, their stolen humanity, poured into the cursed surface, feeding it, enlarging it. The building shook, floorboards splitting, beams groaning. Yet it did not collapse, as if the structure itself had become a vessel of sacrifice. The villagers cried prayers, but their words were hollow against the tide of silence spilling from the school. A handful of desperate fathers ran forward, hammers in hand, intent on breaking the door. But before they reached it, the wood warped into seamless wall, no hinges, no handles, no escape. They struck anyway, blows echoing in vain, and with each strike their own features seemed to blur, their eyes clouding, their mouths twisting, until they stumbled backward, terrified that the curse might claim them too. Inside, the surviving children huddled wherever they could, some beneath desks, others pressed into corners, clutching one another, whispering names in fear that even memory might vanish. A girl clung to her brother, repeating his name again and again as if anchoring him against the erasure that claimed so many. Yet when she looked up, his face was gone. His head tilted toward her in silence, and her scream died in her throat as his hands reached out blindly for her. She pushed away, fleeing down a hall that bent into impossible angles, her shadow stretching unnaturally along walls, until she too was consumed by the silence. The mirror's glow spread further, flooding the central hall with a white radiance that flickered like fire yet gave no warmth. The faceless gathered before it, kneeling in rows, their smooth heads bowing as if in worship. The shadow lifted its limbs, and though it had no voice, the air itself vibrated with a command that needed no words. The faceless obeyed, their bodies collapsing into the mirror's surface, sinking through as though drowning in liquid light. One after another they vanished until the hall was empty of life, yet the whisper of their movement lingered like breath on the back of the neck. Only a handful remained untouched, clinging desperately to the farthest rooms, but even they were marked. Their reflections twisted against their will, showing them faceless long before the curse reached them. They screamed, scratched their own skin, begged for release, but nothing could undo what had been set into motion. The villagers outside saw the final act unfold when every window flared with light. Every blank face pressed forward, hundreds upon hundreds layered one upon another, until the entire building glowed like a lantern of the damned. Then in a single instant the light imploded inward, collapsing into silence so profound it smothered breath. The school went dark, utterly still, its walls no longer groaning, its windows black, its doors sealed. Not a cry remained, not a whisper, not a trace of the children who had entered that morning. Only the faceless pressed against the glass were left, frozen in silence, staring outward into the night. The villagers dared not approach until dawn, and when they did, the building seemed lifeless, ordinary, almost peaceful in the cold light of day. But when they peered through the windows, the blank faces remained, countless, pressed in rows, eyes that did not exist staring, mouths that could not speak screaming silently, forever trapped in reflection. They tried to force the doors, but the wood was unyielding, as though grown from the ground itself. They tried to smash the glass, but it held firm, not even scratching beneath their blows. The school had become a tomb, its walls a prison, its windows the only cruel reminder of what had been lost. The faceless children were neither alive nor dead, suspended in a state between, claimed by whatever horror had seeped from the mirror. For the villagers, the climax was not simply an end, but a theft, an erasure of their future, their families, their lineage. No one who entered returned. No sound of human life emerged again. Only the presence of the faceless endured, timeless and eternal, their silent vigil pressing against the glass long after the screams had faded. The shadow from the mirror no longer needed to be seen, for its work was done, and the silence it left was heavier than any scream. That silence spread beyond the school, seeping into the soil, the air, the hearts of those who survived, and from that night onward, the village itself felt hollow, as though its face too had been erased by what had unfolded. The dawn after the night of horror broke without birdsong, without the warmth of sunrise, only a dull gray light that revealed the school standing silent and whole as though nothing had happened. Yet the stillness around it was wrong, heavy, suffocating. The villagers gathered at a distance, their faces pale with fear, their eyes fixed on the black windows where the faceless still pressed, unmoving, eternal. No child emerged, no teacher returned, and though the air was calm, it carried the scent of ash and something metallic, a taste like blood lingering on the tongue. Families wailed, mothers clawing at the earth, fathers cursing gods who had turned their backs, but none dared step closer to the doors. For all its silence, the school radiated a menace more alive than any sound, and the faceless behind the glass bore witness to every sob with blank stares that cut deeper than knives. Panic turned quickly into paralysis, the village losing all sense of normal life. Markets remained empty, fields untended, prayers offered in the shrine rang hollow. For how could faith survive when even children could vanish into the maw of the cursed? Some demanded the building be burned, destroyed with fire and salt. But when they brought torches to its walls, the flames sputtered out, smoke curling back into their faces, choking them until they staggered away coughing. Others argued it must be sealed, forgotten, abandoned to rot. Yet when they tried to hammer boards across the doors, their nails bent, their hammers shattered, and the wood remained smooth and unbroken, defying human will. Desperation drove the villagers to call upon monks from distant temples, men who arrived draped in robes and armed with sutras, chants, and charms of protection. They circled the school, ringing bells, scattering salt, reciting prayers that echoed through the valley. But the building shuddered with each verse, the windows rattled, and the faceless shifted for the first time, their heads turning in perfect unison toward the holy men. The monks faltered, their voices cracking, and one collapsed, clutching his chest as though invisible hands pressed the life from his lungs. The rest fled in terror, abandoning their faith to the silence within those walls. With every failed attempt, the villagers' despair deepened. Nights grew longer, filled with dreams of children without faces wandering the roads, their small hands brushing against doors, leaving cold patches on wood, their silent presence lingering until dawn. Some claimed to hear knocks at their windows, soft, polite, like a child seeking entry. But when they looked outside, no one stood there, only shadows stretching longer than they should. Others swore they saw their own children walking in the distance, calling them with familiar gestures. Yet when they ran to embrace them, they vanished into air, leaving only the soundless echo of feet that were never there. Madness took hold. A mother who had lost 2 sons stood before the school for 3 days without food or water, whispering lullabies to the faceless pressed against the glass, convinced her boys could hear her. On the 4th day, she walked calmly to the door, pressed her hand to the wood, and dissolved into nothingness, her body fading like mist, leaving only her shadow burned into the ground where she stood. The villagers tried to erase the mark, but it remained, a black stain that no rain could wash away. Stories spread quickly beyond the village. Travelers carried tales of the cursed school, of children stolen by spirits, of a mirror that ate souls, of faces wiped clean by an ancient vengeance. Fearful curiosity drew strangers from nearby towns, but few dared come close. Some who did returned changed, their eyes hollow, their speech faltering, repeating fragments of prayers in voices that were not their own. Others never returned at all, their absence swallowed by the legend. The government sent officials once, stern men in uniforms carrying notebooks and skepticism, determined to prove the stories false. They entered the building with confidence, ignoring the villagers' pleas. Yet when they peered through the glass, the villagers saw the same blank faces staring back. Only now there were more. The officials pressed among them, their notebooks still clutched in hands that beat soundlessly against the pane. The curse had no care for authority. Fear turned the land barren. Families abandoned homes, fields lay untended, and the village withered into silence. The school remained untouched, standing at its center like a scar upon the earth, a reminder that time could not heal every wound. Even those who fled could not escape it entirely. In distant towns, they dreamed of faceless children, awoke with bruises shaped like small hands, found mirrors in their homes clouded with fog, though the air was clear. The curse was not bound to walls, it followed memory, and memory could not be erased. For those who stayed, life became ritual of avoidance. They walked wide circles around the building, never daring to let their shadows fall upon its walls. Children born after the tragedy were warned never to look at its windows, never to listen if they heard their names whispered at night, never to accept a hand reaching from shadows. Yet even these rules offered no safety, for the faceless did not need permission to appear. The aftermath of that night was not simply grief, but transformation, the reshaping of an entire community into one defined by loss. The villagers spoke less, their laughter died. Weddings were quiet affairs, births met with uneasy joy. For each new cry of an infant was followed by the fear that the faceless would one day come for them too. The school's shadow stretched over every life, a constant reminder that their world had been pierced by something that defied reason and could not be undone. And yet beneath the fear a darker thought festered, whispered only in secret. Perhaps the faceless were not lost. Perhaps they had been claimed for a purpose beyond human understanding. Perhaps they were not victims but chosen. Such whispers spread like infection, planting doubts that corroded faith and loyalty, turning neighbor against neighbor, parent against parent. For what if those who vanished were not gone at all, but waiting on the other side of the mirror, calling for the living to join them? Seasons changed, but the school did not. Its roof still intact, its walls unrotted, its windows forever filled with blank faces staring outward in eternal silence. And the villagers who had once believed that time could wear down curses came to understand that some wounds never faded, they only deepened. Fields around the village grew wild, crops refusing to take root as though the earth itself rejected life near the place of erasure. And livestock that strayed too close were found days later wandering without eyes or mouths, their bodies alive, but their faces wiped clean like the children within the building. Farmers abandoned their land, moving deeper into the mountains, leaving homes empty, shutters banging in the wind, paths overgrown with weeds, while the school remained, a black heart pulsing at the center of the valley. Festivals that once filled the air with song and laughter became silent memorials where prayers were whispered quickly. Candles lit and extinguished before their smoke could drift toward the cursed building. Even weddings were marked by dread, couples vowing not only to one another but to the spirits, begging to be spared the fate of the faceless. The aftermath was not simply sorrow, but transformation into a culture of fear, a way of living shaped entirely by what had been lost. Families carried mirrors from their homes, shattering them in fields far away, terrified that any reflection might open a doorway for the curse to seep through. Children were warned never to linger near still water, never to gaze into puddles or lakes, for some swore the faceless could be seen in those surfaces, pressing from beneath, waiting to pull the careless down. Entire generations grew up under these warnings, their childhoods poisoned by caution, their games ending when shadows lengthened, their laughter hushed in case it drew unwanted attention. Outsiders who stumbled into the valley often left quickly, unsettled by the silence that clung to every street, the way doors closed before they could knock, the way villagers spoke only in murmurs as if louder words might wake something sleeping in the ground. Those who lingered sometimes vanished, joining the silent ranks behind the glass, their features erased within days of arrival, proof that the curse had no patience for strangers. The government, humiliated by the failure of its officials, ceased further attempts, declaring the matter closed, refusing to acknowledge the stories. Maps were redrawn, the village left unmarked, its name stricken from records as if erasure could extend to memory itself. Yet travelers still carried whispers, and the legend of the faceless spread wider, reaching ports, towns, even foreign ears, who dismissed it as folklore, but could not shake the chill it left. For the villagers there was no such distance, only daily survival beneath the gaze of the faceless. Some went mad, claiming to hear the voices of their lost children through the glass, voices no one else could hear, promising comfort if only they would step closer. A few obeyed, pressing their palms to the windows in the dead of night, and before anyone could stop them, their features blurred, and they joined the silent legion beyond. Others grew obsessed with finding answers, digging in the mountains for clues, scouring old texts for mention of curses tied to mirrors, but each discovery led only to darker possibilities. Records spoke of older tragedies, villages swallowed in silence, mirrors found buried deep in shrines and sealed with warnings not to disturb them. Some scholars suggested the school had been built upon such a site, its foundations resting on ground never meant for human habitation. If so, the curse had not been born in 1937 but merely awakened, waiting for children's laughter to stir it from centuries of sleep. The aftermath stretched beyond grief into obsession, for the unknown was more terrifying than the truth, and every unanswered question festered like an open wound. Survivors who moved far away carried the curse in memory, their children growing up with stories of faceless classmates, their grandchildren inheriting dreams they could not explain. Some families changed their names, Desperate to sever ties, yet still the faceless appeared in nightmares. Shadows at the foot of beds, reflections in darkened windows. The curse had become more than a place, it had become a legacy. Back in the village, the people stopped counting years. Calendars were left blank, seasons unmarked, for time itself seemed irrelevant when every day was only another survival under the gaze of blank stares. Yet even in despair there were those who clung to hope. A group of elders gathered once more at the shrine, offering sacrifices of rice and sake, chanting through the night, pleading for forgiveness. At dawn the ground quaked, the schools, windows rattled, and for a moment the faceless moved, their heads tilting in unison toward the shrine. The quake ceased. The silence returned, but the villagers understood it as an answer, though whether acceptance or rejection they could not tell. And so hope soured into dread, for even when the curse acknowledged them, it gave no mercy. The aftermath of that night was not a single generation's burden, but a chain binding every life that followed. The children of survivors carried fear in their veins. The grandchildren carried silence in their voices, and the school remained as eternal as the mountains, unchanged, unbroken, its windows forever filled with faces that were not faces, watching, waiting, judging. Some believed the faceless were trapped, suffering, longing for release, while others whispered they had become something greater, something beyond humanity, and it was the living who were to be pitied, not the lost. Whichever truth one believed, the weight of the curse was the same, pressing on the village like an invisible hand, shaping every choice, every word, every silence. The school was no longer a place of learning, but a monument to horror, a reminder that innocence could be devoured in a single night and that even memory could be twisted into a weapon. And yet, through all of this, the faceless endured. Their blank stares unblinking, their silent vigil unending. The ultimate aftermath of a night when identity itself had been stolen, and humanity left to wonder if faces were ever truly secure. The years that followed only deepened the mystery of the faceless school. For though time passed and generations came and went, the building remained untouched by decay, its walls as straight as the day they were raised, its windows unbroken, and within those windows the blank faces still pressed outward, a silent audience to the living world that had abandoned them. Scholars who heard of the legend debated its meaning, some claiming it was a mass delusion born from grief, others suggesting it was a tale invented to keep children obedient. Yet those who dared travel to the valley returned with eyes darkened, voices trembling, swearing that what they had seen could not be explained by madness or folklore. The greatest mystery lay in the mirror itself, for no record of its origin was ever found. Villagers whispered that it had been unearthed during construction, dragged from the foundations and placed in the hallway by workers who thought nothing of its strange surface, unaware that they had disturbed something buried for centuries. Others claimed it was older still, brought from a ruined shrine lost in the mountains, a relic meant to contain spirits that should never have been released. No matter the tale, the truth remained hidden, locked within the cracks that pulsed with light and silence. Scientists who attempted to investigate found their instruments failing, compasses spinning wildly, cameras refusing to capture images of the faceless, lenses clouding with fog though the air was clear. One report spoke of a man who attempted to sketch what he saw, only to find his hands trembling uncontrollably, the lines twisting into grotesque spirals until his pencil snapped. He left the valley that same night and was never seen again. The mirror's defiance of study became legend itself, proof to the villagers that it was never meant for human eyes. Another layer of mystery clung to the faceless victims, for though hundreds had been claimed, their bodies never withered, never decayed. Each day they stood pressed against the glass, their forms frozen in the moment of their erasure, their clothes unchanged, their hands forever lifted. Were they alive in some twisted sense, suspended between worlds, or were they corpses preserved by the curse? The villagers argued endlessly, some believing their loved ones still suffered within, others insisting they had been transformed into spirits, their shells left behind as warnings. Dreams offered no answers, only more confusion. For those who dreamed of the faceless reported hearing voices behind the silence, soft whispers calling their names, promises of reunion if only they would come closer. Some believed these were tricks of the curse, lures meant to draw new victims, but others insisted the voices were real, that the faceless were begging to be freed, trapped in torment beyond imagination. The government's silence added to the enigma, for files were sealed, maps redrawn, and mention of the incident erased from records. Why would officials go to such lengths to deny something if it had never truly occurred? Conspiracy took root. Whispers that the mirror had been known to authorities long before the tragedy, that its presence had been hidden deliberately, and that the school had been built not by accident but by design, as though the children had been offered knowingly to feed an ancient hunger. No proof surfaced, but the absence of proof only strengthened the suspicions, for in the shadows of history, truth and silence often walk hand in hand. Religious scholars saw the faceless as punishment, a divine retribution for arrogance, for building upon sacred ground without respect. Others argued it was no punishment at all but a curse older than God's, a remnant of something from before memory, a crack in the world itself through which the inhuman leaked. Their debates filled books and temples, yet none dared to step closer. None dared to look upon the mirror with their own eyes, for even the most faithful quailed before the unknown. The villagers themselves became keepers of the unanswered. They no longer asked why, only how to endure, for every attempt to solve the mystery had ended in deeper terror. Yet their silence was not ignorance but survival, a recognition that some truths were too dangerous to pursue. Still, questions lingered in every heart. Why had some children been erased instantly while others lingered for days? Why had some villagers seen apparitions while others saw nothing? Why did the curse follow some families across generations while sparing others? No answer came, only the endless staring of the faceless, their blank features refusing to reveal what lay behind them. The deepest mystery, perhaps, was not the curse itself, but the silence it demanded, a silence so total that it spread beyond the school, swallowing laughter, crushing prayers, reducing lives to whispers. Silence became the language of survival. And in that silence the faceless thrived, their blank stares more eloquent than words. Some said the mystery would never be solved because it was not meant to be, that the mirror was a wound in the world and wounds do not explain themselves, they only bleed. Others believed the truth waited still, hidden in forgotten texts, buried beneath the earth, locked within dreams yet to be dreamt. But every year that passed without answers made hope feel thinner, until the mystery itself became a kind of curse, gnawing at the edges of reason, leaving only the haunting certainty that something vast and unknowable had touched their world and left its mark forever. Legends spread like roots twisting beneath the soil of memory, and the mystery of the faceless school grew far beyond the valley, reaching distant lands where storytellers wove it into their own cultures. Yet no version ever explained the truth, only layered more uncertainty upon the original wound. Travelers who claimed to have seen the building spoke of strange sensations, of air that grew heavier the closer they walked, of shadows that seemed to breathe, of silence so dense it pressed against their eardrums until they thought they might go deaf. Some described the mirror not as an object but as a presence, a dark consciousness that seemed aware of being observed, shifting subtly when watched, as if its cracks formed symbols too fleeting to be deciphered. The more one tried to understand, the less sense it made, for the mirror resisted comprehension with the same determination it resisted destruction. Priests brought from temples attempted exorcisms, chanting through nights, burning incense that filled the valley with smoke. Yet when dawn arrived, the faceless remained, unblinking, and the priests themselves grew pale, their voices broken, whispering that they had heard laughter rising from the cracks, laughter that mocked their prayers. Some refused to ever speak again, their silence deeper than death. Records uncovered from forgotten archives only added to the confusion, for hints of faceless figures appeared across centuries, scribbled in margins of old scrolls, etched on stones in abandoned shrines, always accompanied by images of mirrors. Could the faceless have existed long before the school, returning again and again to different places, leaving behind ruins and legends that vanished into time? If so, then the valley was only the most recent stage in an endless performance. The mystery of identity itself hung in the air, for the faceless were not monsters in the usual sense. They were children, teachers, neighbors, familiar shapes stripped of their defining feature. What was a human without a face, a body without self, a presence without voice, a shadow of what it once was? Philosophers debated whether the faceless were truly gone, or whether their essence had merged with the mirror, forming a collective existence beyond individuality. If so, was it torment or transcendence? Was the erasure a punishment or a transformation into something greater? Every possibility only deepened the horror, for none brought peace. The strangest accounts came from those few who dreamed of the faceless not with fear, but with longing. They claimed the blank figures were not threatening but beckoning, promising release from pain, release from the burden of identity, a chance to dissolve into pure silence where nothing could hurt. To those weary of life, such dreams became temptations, and more than one villager was found wandering toward the school at night, their eyes glazed, their steps steady, as if answering a call. No one who crossed the threshold returned. Another mystery surrounded the passage of time within the building. From outside, the faceless never moved, but rare reports from those who had dared step through the door before being dragged out insisted the inside was different, that shadows shifted like tides, that whispers filled the air, that sometimes the faceless walked, turning their blank heads in eerie unison. If true, then the school was no longer part of the ordinary world but a realm of its own, ruled by laws humans could not grasp. The question became whether the faceless were trapped or whether they ruled that place willingly, their blankness not a loss but a key to another existence. And yet the greatest mystery was not what had been seen but what remained unseen. Why had no one in all the decades since succeeded in shattering the glass, burning the school, demolishing the foundation? Every attempt had failed, as if the world itself protected the curse. Fires would not spread, explosives fizzled, machines broke down at the threshold. It was as though the building existed in a state beyond destruction, untouchable by human tools. Some speculated that the mirror was not truly in the school but only a window to somewhere deeper, and to destroy it would require striking at a place unreachable by earthly means. If so, then humanity stood powerless before it, condemned to watch but never to act. The villagers grew tired of questions, tired of outsiders, tired of being treated as keepers of a puzzle that had no solution. To them, the mystery was not wonder but suffering, not curiosity but prison. Yet even they could not help but feel its pull, for mystery has a way of consuming even those who wish to ignore it. Children born in the valley still dreamed of the faceless, though their parents forbade them from speaking of it. Some drew pictures in secret, pictures of blank heads, of cracked mirrors, of staircases leading downward into darkness. These drawings were hidden, destroyed, but they returned again and again as though knowledge could not be erased, only suppressed. And so the mystery became generational, passed like an inheritance of fear, each child destined to carry questions their elders could not answer. The world outside the valley forgot, but forgetting did not end the curse, it only allowed it to grow unnoticed, waiting. Some whispered that the faceless would one day leave the glass, that the cracks would spread beyond the school, opening across the land like veins, reflecting blankness into every face. Whether prophecy or madness, the possibility lingered, that the mystery was not confined but expanding, that what had begun as a single night of erasure might end with the world itself staring back without features, without voices, without end. And in that silence, the true depth of the mystery would be revealed, not in answers but in the final realization that some questions were never meant to be solved, only endured until the last face was gone. The story of the faceless school does not conclude with answers, for no key was ever found to unlock the silence. No scholar or priest ever uncovered the truth behind the mirror, and no parent ever saw the features of their child returned. Yet endings are not always measured by resolution. Sometimes they are measured only by the weight left upon those who survive, and the weight of this tale was crushing, pressing down upon every soul who dared remember. In the valley where the building stood, generations grew up beneath its shadow, and though they were told to stay away, though fences were raised and signs were nailed warning trespassers to turn back, still the presence of the faceless seeped into every corner of life. Farmers claimed their cattle refused to graze near the boundary, their eyes rolling white when led too close. Children whispered dares to each other at night, speaking of the blank figures as though summoning them with words. The air itself seemed altered, heavy and still as though waiting for something to stir. Those who had lost loved ones never truly healed. For grief depends upon closure, and there was no closure here. Only the eternal uncertainty of not knowing whether the ones they loved were gone or trapped, alive in torment or dissolved into nothingness. Some parents sat for hours outside the building, staring at the window panes where faceless shapes stood, convincing themselves that the stance, the tilt of the head, the height of a figure was proof that their child remained. They called out softly, knowing no reply would come but unwilling to leave the silence unanswered. In time, their bodies grew frail, their hair white, and still they came until one by one they joined the earth without having found peace. The valley became a place of abandoned prayers, for the gods seemed absent here. Their temples crumbled, their altars unattended, as if even divinity feared to look upon the faceless. Those who tried to bring light met only deeper darkness. Torches cast shadows that moved unnaturally. Candles sputtered out, and no fire would burn long near the mirror. When night fell, the school loomed black against the stars, its windows faintly aglow with the pallid light of the cracks, as though the building itself was alive, watching. Travelers from afar sought it out, drawn by morbid curiosity, and some never left. Those who did leave often carried a new silence with them, unable to describe what they had seen, unable to rid themselves of the image of blank faces pressed close, lips that were not lips whispering without sound. They became wanderers, haunted by what they had glimpsed, spreading fragments of the story until the school became legend, distorted by distance yet never forgotten. It entered the realm of ghost stories, of cautionary tales told by firelight. Yet within the valley the fear was never entertainment. It was life itself, woven into the way people walked, the way they hushed their children, the way they built their houses with windows facing away from the cursed ground. Even those who never set eyes on the faceless felt their influence, for dread can spread without proof, and terror needs no invitation to root itself in the mind. The tragedy of 1937 cast a shadow longer than time should allow, a wound that refused to scar, bleeding still in whispered warnings and restless dreams. For the faceless did not only belong to the past, they lingered unchanged, preserved in blank eternity. A reminder that some horrors do not end but endure, waiting for those foolish or desperate enough to seek them. And so the ending of the story is not an ending at all, but a lingering presence, a silence that outlives every word, a gaze that has no eyes yet sees more than anyone dares admit. What remains is the haunting certainty that the faceless school still stands. The mirror still pulses, and the figures within still wait. Not dead, not alive, but something between, something outside the grasp of reason. And in that certainty lies the most tragic ending of all, not the loss of lives, but the loss of knowing, the eternal absence of closure, the endless weight of mystery that drags across generations like chains, binding the living to the silence of the vanished. The valley remains quiet, but it is not the peaceful quiet of forgotten places. It is the suffocating quiet of a wound that refuses to close, and those who have walked its paths know the difference well. Silence hangs there like a living thing, heavy and watchful, and travelers who pass through speak of hearing footsteps that do not belong to them, of glimpsing reflections in puddles that do not match their faces, of feeling the undeniable weight of being observed by eyes that do not exist. The school itself stands untouched by seasons, its wood unrotted, its stone unstained, as if time itself bends around it, unwilling to lay claim. No vines climb its walls, no animals seek shelter within, and even the birds that wheel above change their paths to avoid its shadow. Inside, the faceless figures remain, pressed eternally against the glass, frozen in the same unnatural stillness, their presence as much a part of the building as the beams and bricks. To those who have seen them, the image becomes impossible to forget. Dreams fill with their blank stares, waking hours echo with the weight of their silence, and even those who never dared approach the school find themselves haunted by the legend. For stories have power, and this story has carved itself into the marrow of the world. Attempts to erase it have failed. Officials can seal files, cartographers can redraw maps, and teachers can refuse to speak of it. But history clings stubbornly to its shadows, and shadows have ways of seeping through cracks no hand can close. The faceless remain in whispered rumors, in fragments of journals, in drawings made by trembling hands, in the pale terror that flickers across the faces of the elderly when the subject is mentioned. What they are remains unanswered. But perhaps the true horror is not in what they became, but in what they took with them, the certainty of who they were. Names fade, identities vanish, and with them the comfort of remembrance. Those who once had faces are now only the faceless, stripped of individuality, merged into one endless silent crowd. And this loss is a deeper cruelty than death itself. The tragedy of the faceless school lingers not because of the number of victims, but because of the emptiness it left behind, a void that refuses to be filled. Every story ends with silence. Every investigation ends with failure. Every prayer ends with unanswered echoes. And so the people of the valley learn to live not with hope, but with resignation, building their lives around the shadow, carrying the weight of an ending that never truly arrived. They did not rebuild, They did not reclaim. They only endured, because endurance was all that remained. The faceless became both memory and prophecy, both past and future, a reminder that what was lost might one day return, not as salvation but as contagion, spreading blankness across every face until the world itself reflected only absence. In this way, the story of the faceless school closes, not with resolution but with haunting, not with truth but with tragedy, not with silence broken, but with silence eternal. And as long as the building stands, as long as the mirror glows faintly in the dark, as long as blank forms press against the glass, the ending will never truly come. It will stretch onward into centuries yet unwritten, a shadow waiting at the edge of history, a reflection that has no features, a reminder that some stories do not end at all. They simply wait, faceless, patient, unblinking, eternal.